Hi, I'm Dick Thomas, and I'm a psychologist in Waterville at the hospital. And over the last 20 years, my hobby has been reading about renewable energy and climate science. And so I really appreciate that you're watching today. We're going to hear some very interesting things, I think.
My name is Titan Berg. After teaching at Colby for 30 years as a member of the economics department, I retired in 2008. My area of focus for my research and publications is energy economics and environmental economics.
My name is Peter Garrett. I ain't from here, as you can probably get. I'm from England, but I married a girl from Winslow, and we live on the 100 acres that she was raised on, and we love it. And there I built a passive solar home that uses very little to heat itself. I'm also a geologist, so I know a lot about Earth history, and more recently I've been investigating climate science, and I'm particularly involved in talking to our members of Congress about climate science and the kinds of things that they should be doing to protect us from climate change.
Ellery?
My name is Ellery Keene. I was for 30 years the executive director of the Kennebec Valley Council of Governments, an organization helping municipalities deal with environmental and economic concerns throughout Somerset County, Kennebec County, and Western Waldo County. And I have a master's degree in civil engineering and a master's degree in urban and regional planning. I live in Winslow.
Okay, so experts agree that in the future our energy systems are going to be really different from what we have today. And fortunately, we're all going to be able to save money by switching to renewable energy and investing in energy efficiency. Now, we've got some experience with that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Tell you some of the ways you can save money. And Peter, do you want to start us?
Yes. So I'm going to tell you about the house that my wife lived in when she was a little girl. It's an 1800s Cape Cod in Winslow, and her father said that he needed to cut 9 cords of firewood in order to heat it. My wife says that the heating was done by 2 stoves, a wood stove in the living room and a wood stove in the kitchen, a cook stove. And the 9 cords, she says, didn't really heat it the way we like buildings to be heated now, because there was always a frost on the windows when she'd get up in the morning. And then my father-in-law had a heart attack, and after that the family bought into an oil furnace for central heating. And from the stories I hear tell, it burned through 3 tanks of oil. So when my parents-in-law passed on, we thought we should do something about the house. And basically, as Dick says, spend some money to save some money. And so this is what we did. We first of all started blowing in insulation in the attic and in the walls. And we replaced those rattly wooden windows with storm windows on the outside with a vinyl frame, double pane windows that really fit their spaces. And that did a whole bunch of good, and we got down to maybe 2 tanks of oil. But we hadn't got done then. We thought it would be a good idea to hire an energy auditor. And he came in and did what energy auditors do, which is to install a temporary, what's called a blower door. and it's a funny kind of a plastic thing, but it has a fan in the door, and it sucks air out of the house so that the energy auditor can go around looking around the house for places where the cold air is coming in through holes that you don't even see. And he helped us to seal up those holes and made also some recommendations for what else to do. And one of the things he did really puzzled us. It didn't seem reasonable at the time. He said you needed to spray foam the upper 4 feet of the cellar walls. And the cellar walls, it was an old Cape Cod. These were rock walls held together with, I guess, some cement. And I guess there were some small holes in them through the rocks because the mice used to get in. And we knew that, so that if the mice are getting in, presumably cold air got in too. Anyway, we foamed those cellar walls, and that made a huge difference. It surprised us, kept the mice out, which was nice, but it also made it so that we got down to less than a tank of oil to heat the building. So you can see we're spending money to save money. And by that time, we'd rented out the house, and we found that the 2 sets of renters had used less than a tank of oil. So then, the next thing we did was to include 1 full tank of oil in the rental agreement. The renters just loved that, and because it made sure that they didn't have to spend an enormous amount to heat the place. And then we did one more thing. We installed an air-to-air heat pump, because heat pumps are, although they cost quite a bit to own, something like $3,000 to have them installed, they'll save you at least $1,000 a year in your energy costs. So we did that, and we reduced the rent accordingly. And so there we've got an old house that was a really energy hog, and we've got it now such that the renters just love it, and they pay a lot less to heat it, and everybody's happy. We'd like you to do something similar on your place.
Okay. Now, I started with a new house about 10 years ago. I helped somebody design the house, and so it's all very tightly built and well insulated. And I was reading about heat pumps and realized I would save a lot of money if I had a heat pump instead of an oil furnace. In fact, if you've got an oil furnace now and you switch to a heat pump, that will pay itself off very quickly and you'll save money. So that's what I used to heat the house, and I put solar panels on the roof, and that cost me $18,000. But the nice thing is the solar panels, they take care of the heat pump. And in 15 years, the money that I save every year is going to pay off the loan for those solar panels. And then it's going to be free energy, both to heat and to cool the house. And summers are getting warmer, so being able to cool a house is going to be more and more important. So.
Thank you. Dick, if I could follow up on some of the things you said,
Yeah.
just to give people a kind of order of things. The insulation for some existing house, which you didn't have to do necessarily because you built your house.
Yeah.
Then the switch to a heat pump, the lowest cost form of heating and, as you mentioned, cooling.
Yeah.
And then the solar to power the heat pump and other electrical things is the kind of order you should do it in.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I designed and had my house built that I live in now, 1972-73. That winter it was built. And I didn't put a thick enough layer of insulation in my house, and it's still that way. But later, when Jimmy Carter was president, most of us became aware of the necessity of trying to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we used in our homes, in our cars too, by the way. And I added another layer of insulation on the roof, under the, on the top of the ceilings of the house, which did a lot of savings. I also put some 1-inch thick fiber panels, maybe they're sort of plastic, on, and I glued them to the walls of my basement. And that's saved a lot of energy loss through that, so that system. Much more recently, I had somebody install some inside storm windows, so to speak. It's another layer of windows using plastic instead of glass, and this makes 2 additional layers of air between the outside cold air and the inside, which greatly reduces the loss of energy through the windows. And they can be removed in the summertime and reinstalled in the wintertime, so that I can still open my windows in the summertime when I want to.
Peter, would you mind talking a little bit about window dressers? Because I know that's a volunteer group that builds these interior storm windows for people at a very low price.
Indeed. If you want to find out more, you can go to a website called Window Dressers. It's all one word, USA. I think that's the address. Window Dressers is I think a volunteer organization based in Rockport that's been expanding its work across the state, and we have efforts going on here in Waterville and Fairfield, and also Vassalborough just recently. And the way it works is this: somebody comes into your house, measures up the space of the window, so the height and the width. Then a wood frame is made down in Rockland. They have the saw and they get all of the wood in there. And it could be a white frame or it could be a wood frame, depending upon what you want. And then it goes to a workshop, and the workshop happens in your town. Could be here in the Fairfield Community Center, or it could be any place where you have sufficient space to bring in anywhere from, I guess, 9 to 18 volunteers. The volunteers could be you, could be your neighbors, and they make up they put the plastic coating on these wood frames, and then you take them away and install them in the windows that they are measured to fit. And they make they're very low cost. They're much lower cost than buying a new window, and it's well worth looking into that. So if that appeals to you, go to Window Dressers. Thanks.
And those inserts, they save so much money. It pays for the cost of the insert in 1 year.
Oh, that's
After
right.
that, it's all just savings.
Well, so far, we've heard about a lot of opportunities with respect to homeowners to save money and save energy. But I'd like to make the point, too, that businesses can also save something by being more efficient with their energy use, and I'd like to give you a couple of examples. One comes from an invitation I got one time to visit a business in South Portland called National Semiconductor. They build chips for phones, for other electronic devices. And when the plant manager gave us the tour, he made a point of pointing out the manufacturing room, and it turns out that room is very sensitive to conditions because making the chips is a very delicate operation. And so the temperatures have to be precise, and there has to be no dust. And so the air handling equipment is very precise and, as you might imagine, very expensive, and uses a lot of electricity. Well, he told me that what they had done is they had found out that they could use solid state electrical air handling systems, and in the process save 40% of their electric costs. So they did that, they installed them, they worked fine. So when he finished talking about that, I asked him, I said, did this make a difference to your plant? And he kind of smiled at me, and I knew something was coming. And he said, Tom, it did. He said, right after that, we found out that because of the recession, one of the company's plants would have to close. And they'd finally worked it down to 2 plants. One was in Texas, and the other one was in South Portland. And he said, we were a little worried because the price of energy was higher in Maine than it was in Texas. But he said, ultimately, what worked out is the plant in Maine stayed open. And the reason for that is that their energy cost was lower. And remember, energy cost is not only price, but it's also how much you consume. And because they had invested in saving energy and got this 40% reduction in electricity and electricity cost, they were able to stay in business. My second story is TexTac. And TexTac is a really interesting company. One of the things it makes is the covering for tennis balls. It operates out of Monmouth, Maine. But now it also has gotten a bit more high-tech, and it does things from the aerospace industry to the Department of Defense, law enforcement, and so on. They had decided that because of the high energy costs in Maine, they were planning to actually move their production facilities from Monmouth overseas in order to get lower costs. And it turns out that they started that process, but then discovered that they could actually switch fuels and move from their high-cost oil to a biomass boiler, which they did. And it turns out that that saved them $400,000 a year in energy costs. And so when that happened, they decided they didn't need to move their production out of Maine. They could keep it in Maine. And it is still here. In fact, the company is thriving. So these are 2 stories, but there are lots of others. I mean, could mention names like Hannaford and Jackson Labs and so on, who have publicly testified in press releases that they have saved a lot of money by doing energy efficiency, or in some cases, fuel switching. But what's also important is that studies have shown that not only do these kind of activities save money for those who undertake them, but they also boost the economy as a whole. And there are several reasons for that, but let me at least try to give you a flavor of that by mentioning 3. One is that, as you can imagine, the businesses that now have lower costs are more competitive. And that means their business does better, and that drives up income. The second thing is that instead of importing energy where the money they spend goes somewhere else, they actually use energy from here. And the result of that is that the money circulates in the local economy, and that has what economists call a multiplier effect. It boosts income beyond what it would if we were depending totally on imported goods. And the final one is a bit more complicated, but it's also, I think, a bit more interesting. And that is that because these sources like solar and energy efficiency can be targeted at specific geographic areas, they can save energy in those areas, and that has another effect. Namely, it may mean that you don't have to build new transmission lines to handle them. Let me give you an example. Booth Bay Harbor, of course, is a hot summer spot on the Maine coast. And not surprising, it's growing, and it's running into problems with its electricity demand exceeding the capacity to supply that electricity. So the CMP, our power company, basically said, well, why don't we build a new transmission line down there to expand that capacity? And that transmission line basically would have cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 million to build. And then because it was used and charged for over its life, some estimates indicated that it would have cost ratepayers about $75 million over the life of the sort of transmission line. So that's a significant expense. So the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, basically said to itself, could we possibly find an alternative that would be cheaper than that? And they thought, well, you know, if we used some solar in Bar Harbor, and if we got storage so we could handle peaks, and we did energy efficiency so we didn't need quite as much, we might be able to eliminate the need to expand that capacity. So they gave a contract to a group, and they went out, they did this, and for $6 million, of all these activities of solar, storage, and so on, they eliminated the need to build that $75 million transmission line. So they spent $6 and they saved $75 million. That boosts the economy.
Wow, what a story. So there's one other thing that's important to bear in mind, and that is the solar installation creates jobs. One of the things that we haven't heard in the solar conversation that's been going on in the main state, legislature, and that is that nationwide, that job creation in the solar industry is something like 10 times as fast as the average of all the other industries that employ people. The growth of solar is that much. So it makes a lot of sense for us to think solar and to convert our energy source towards that. There's another. I'm going to take the liberty of going a little bit further than that and giving a bit of a history lesson. About 200 years ago or so, somebody figured out that they could take a rock, a black rock known as coal, and burn it and get it to do various things with steam engines at first, such that the work of humans could be done much more efficiently by burning this coal. And then after coal had been used for quite a number of years, of decades that is, then somebody figured out that there was this liquid called oil that could do just about the same kind of thing, and in certain circumstances could be made more useful in various ways. And then we've come to natural gas. All of these things that we call the fossil fuels, and that's because they come from actually the decomposition of old animals and plants buried in rocks. Fossil fuels seems like a funny kind of nickname, but there it is. And the problem is that we as a whole haven't recognized that they produce a waste product. And the waste product is called carbon dioxide, and you don't even see it. It just goes away in the air when you burn any of these things, coal, oil, or natural gas. And not only carbon dioxide, but all kinds of other gases go away in the emissions. And one of the peculiar things that we haven't quite figured out what to do about yet is that trash, what we call garbage or trash or whatever it is, we pay the towns to take it away from from wherever we leave it, roadside, or deal with even a recycle thing. But we don't pay for discharge of carbon dioxide and other emissions that all of us are very much a part of at the moment. We don't pay for it. So, what if we did pay for it? Wouldn't that actually, it would put up the price of the fossil fuels, the coal, oil, and natural gas, yes, but wouldn't it actually produce a fund that we could use to reduce the cost of climate change that is coming with those carbon dioxide emissions?
Okay, thank you. So what we're talking about here is really three different benefits of switching to renewable energy and increasing energy efficiency. You know, sometimes it's not always worthwhile to make a big change if you only have one benefit. But in this case, it's going to save us money personally, it's going to improve our economy, and by cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions, we're also preserving the healthy climate that our grandchildren are going to need to live good lives. So this is a win-win-win.
One of the interesting questions then from an economic point of view is the question of how much do we invest in that as well. And economic studies are very helpful there. They make two things clear that I think are worth thinking about. One, that reducing carbon emissions is cheaper than not reducing carbon emissions. And the reason for that primarily is that if you don't reduce carbon emissions, then they go out into the atmosphere and they produce a modified climate that has consequences, that creates damages like sea level rise and droughts and storm surges, etc. And economists have actually monetized both of those and found out that doing some kind of mitigation of carbon emissions is much cheaper than actually suffering the consequences if you don't do that. Let me give you just one numerical example. Right now, in a program to control carbon in the state, a ton of carbon can be reduced for about $3.79. Economists basically, in taking all the studies and sort of finding the median study, concluded that basically that same ton of carbon, if it were actually emitted into the environment, would produce damages somewhere in the neighborhood between $30 and $40 a ton. There's a huge difference there. So it's cheaper to sort of take action than it is to leave it for inaction. The second thing we learned is that basically the timing of the action matters too. In particular, what the studies have found, again, looking at all the studies and sort of choosing some kind of median, is that the more you wait, the more it costs. And in particular, if you wait a decade, it costs you about 40% more to do the same thing. Now, the reason for that, incidentally, just to give a little background, is that a team from NASA sort of found out that when you put carbon in the air, a percentage of the carbon dioxide stays there not only for centuries, but as much as 1,000 years. So that means that everything that we put in the air now stays there for a considerably long time and will have large impacts for a very long time. What that means is that when the international community sets targets to try to protect us from the worst ravages of climate change, they, in fact, we can back that up and find out how many emissions that allows us to emit and still not exceed those targets. And it turns out that the longer we wait, the smaller that window of opportunity. And that means that the cost is higher because you have to have deeper emission cuts and you have to do it in a smaller period of time. Both of those raise the cost.
If I could follow on that, Tom, our very own Senator Collins, called on the Government Accounting Office to do a study of what the costs of recovering from climate change enhanced weather events. That's not earthquakes, but it does include wildfires, hurricanes, floods and droughts particularly, and the ones that are getting bigger because of climate, just like you mentioned. And what the Government Accounting Office found was, okay, so they did a study over the last 10 years. And what Senator Collins told the Senate when she gave a talk in October of 2017, she said that the study had found that the additional costs of recovery from such events was something like $300 billion over a decade. Now, she said that in October 2017 when we were basically in the middle of I think, a record year of expense in recovering from such events. You remember Hurricane Harvey down in Houston, Hurricane Irma, and then Hurricane Maria. All were devastating to various parts of the country, Florida and Puerto Rico in particular. There were actually 16 such events, not all hurricanes, but wildfires, of course, that took place in the West. There were 16 events that cost over $1 billion to recover from. And the total cost for all those events in 2017 added up to something like $306 billion in 1 year. So far exceeding what the government accounting office had said for a decade. So just doing a little math, you're all probably good at hand calculators. So if you divide 306 billion by the population of the United States, which is approximately 325 million, you find that every man, woman, and child is contributing in some way or other, increased taxes, increased insurance, or whatever, contributing $940 per person just for that 1 year's events. Now, that's kind of scary, and it's kind of scary especially as we are seeing, thanks to what you said, Tom, about the increasing costs year over year, or I guess decade over decade, and that, as you mentioned, it's lower cost to deal with it now than to wait another decade to think about doing something. Thank you.
Another economy problem that is already affecting people in Maine is the opportunity for getting certain kinds of fish type of things out of the ocean along the coast of the Maine, because the water is getting warmer and also more acidic as a result of the climate change problem. Some of the fish, especially lobsters, but also crabs and other shrimp, yeah. And if it may be too late to even save most of this, but lobster fishermen are already moving east, if they can, to get somewhat cooler water. But if we allow the oceans to continue to warm even hotter than they are, the lobster fishery in these other will be gone, and we will lose a very significant part of our main economy. And of course, this will affect the eastern part of Canada as well. We need to do something about it.
You know, another thing that's happening with the ocean right now is that because things are getting more acidic, the plankton is being affected by that. At this point, we have about 20% less plankton in the ocean. And that's important in two ways. One is that half of the oxygen in the world comes from plankton. And the other is that plankton is the bottom of the food chain in the ocean. So little fish eat it, bigger fish eat them. If we lose the plankton, we really lose that whole food chain. And a lot of human beings rely on the oceans to survive.
And it's not just Maine. One of the problems that's already occurred is to the Great Barrier Reef along the northern coast of Australia, which has been habitat for many important types of creatures that live in the water, and it's gone already. It's not just Maine, but we care more, maybe a little more about Maine, but it's happening all around the world. And the rising water is covering land in various, especially islands, where people have had their houses and their docks, and when they're covered with water sometimes part of the year, sometimes all of the year now. It costs them a lot of money to move inland, and are they going to have the place inland where they really have the resources to survive as a people? It's a real problem.
So now we're getting into the difficult part of our talk today. You know, just looking at what's happening to the planet. This is a climate science. And I want to tell you about a world-renowned American climate scientist, Dr. Ramanathan. He teaches at San Diego. He does a lot of the writing for the UN, about the climate. And he took a look at all the research last year and came up with what he thinks are the most likely predictions for the future. One is that by 2050, if we don't get much more serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, our climate is going to become dangerous. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, basically, we'll get a lot more of the extreme climate events that we're already seeing. So more floods, more polar vortex, really cold spells in the winter, more droughts, our storms, hurricanes, and thunderstorms get stronger, but survivable. The really hard part is that by the end of the century, things will become a catastrophe if we don't really get serious about cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions. And we'd also have to get some of the carbon dioxide that's in the air, we'd have to get some of that out and sequester it somehow. Now, when he says climate catastrophe, we're not sure exactly what that means yet. It's going to depend on what we do. But the range of possibilities is one, it just might be really bad for our grandkids. The worst case scenario is it might be unsurvivable.
And and it's not just kids who are at stake here. One of the things that's fascinated me as somebody who pays attention to these issues most of the time is how much the military is speaking out. And they have identified climate change as one of the major threats to our national security. Let me give you just, again, a taste of these arguments because they actually go on and on, but just to give you a flavor. One is that the military sort of noted that 3 of our important bases in the Pacific are on low-lying islands. And as the sea level rises with climate change, they'll face 2 problems. One, in the short run, the rising sea and the storms that accompany it will move a lot of seawater onshore, and they're very afraid that it will contaminate the water supplies. The second thing is that over the long run, these islands will cease to exist. They simply will be overflooded with sea level rise. And these are important bases, places you've probably heard of, like Diego Garcia. So that's one kind of concern. The second is that that's not, basically climate change is going to do things like intensify water scarcity. If you read United Nations reports, you discover that water is actually quite scarce on many parts of the planet. And it turns out that climate change is likely to exacerbate that problem. And that creates conflict situation. Think Middle East, for example, where there are serious water scarcities and where there's a lot of conflict now over the limited water that's theirs. And finally, the latest report just came out last week, looked at the question of environmental refugees. And it basically said climate change is going to make a lot of areas which were habitable no longer habitable because they won't be able to do agriculture and the other sources of livelihood for them. And that's going to create a refugee pool. And the latest reports suggested that it would be the biggest refugee crisis the world has ever seen. Tens of millions of people would be dislocated. And the report notes, think about the conflict that was created from the Syrian war, and that was a fraction of the people who are likely to be refugees for this. So they argue that we need to worry about national security, and one of the ways we should worry about it is to do something about climate change.
Okay. Now, the good news is it's not all doom and gloom. it is possible for us to switch very rapidly to renewable energy, and we can avoid all kinds of these disasters. So there's a lot of reasons to switch to renewable energy and become more energy efficient very quickly. And I'd like to mention just two more ideas, ways that we can do this and save money in the process. One of them has to do with our cars. Now, right now, the average annual cost of owning a car in the United States is $7,000. So, of course, that's more if you've got a Mercedes, and less if you buy a secondhand, small, energy-efficient car. But it is expensive. My car is getting pretty old. I was thinking, when it dies, maybe I'll just get a full electric, really small car. But then I realized that half of the carbon emissions that's associated with the lifetime of a car comes from building the thing. So maybe it would be better if I just do without a second car in my family. And so my wife has a car, we'll share that, get me to work. And the other thing that we're going to do is when we get too old to live out in the outskirts of town, we're going to move into town where we can walk to the grocery store. We may not need a car at all. And so that's really going to reduce our carbon emissions. But the other idea is something my son has been pushing me to do. He's a vegan. He wants me to be one. So I read about it, and I was surprised to find that raising livestock for food causes more greenhouse gas emissions than our entire transportation sector.
Wow.
Now, the reason is a lot of oil goes into raising the feed for cows. And the other thing, cows create a huge amount of methane in their stomach every day. And they burp it out, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So what I'm hearing is that if you become a vegetarian, or if you just cut down some on how much meat and dairy that you're eating, you can lower your greenhouse, your carbon footprint just as much as if you were driving a full electric car.
Wow. So we've been talking quite a bit here about actually two things. One is individually how we can save money by energy efficiency, by renewable fuels, and also various other things like your shifting a diet or shifting the way that we drive around and the kinds of vehicles that we use. There are also some things that the government can do to speed things along. And I want to tell you a bit about one of the groups in Congress that's come along actually in the last couple of years. And it's called the Climate Solutions Caucus. Now, you probably know that a caucus is a group of members of Congress who get together every now and again to talk about a particular angle on things. And the Climate Solutions Caucus is quite clear what they're talking about, solutions to the climate issue. And it, as I say, it started about a year and a half ago, and they're already at 74 members. The interesting thing about the Climate Solutions Caucus, however, is that you can't get in it unless you bring in somebody from the other party. So it's intentionally bipartisan, and it so that it means that the Democrats and Republicans are sitting down together to talk about climate solutions. Now, they've come up with, so far, 16 bills which are going through Congress right now, and we are looking particularly for one economic solution, which I'm going to introduce you to. It's called carbon fee and dividend. Carbon fee and dividend. So basically you put a price on carbon fuels, And the price begins at, I know this is a bit difficult to kind of grasp, but it's $10 a ton, sorry, $15 a ton of carbon dioxide emissions. Well, what the heck does a ton of carbon dioxide emissions look like? It's probably enough to fill this room, but you don't have to worry about it too much because we already know what individual fuels produce in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. The price would continue to go up every year, approximately $10 a ton of carbon dioxide emissions. And so there's quite a bit of, oh yes, and this money would be paid by the owners of oil wells, gas wells, coal mines, ports of entry where fossil fuels come into the country, and the refineries. There are only about 1,000 such companies out there. So they would contribute their money. Obviously, the products like gasoline and fuel oil and all the other things would go up in price. So what would happen to all the money that was collected in that carbon fee? Well, it would come back to all of us, every household, as a dividend. And the amount of the dividend has been calculated that it would make approximately 2/3 of the population whole, or give them a little bit more than the increased costs. So the real benefit of this proposal is that it puts a price on the carbon dioxide emissions that, as we've talked about a little bit earlier, are causing some of the increased costs of, for instance, the recovery from these climate change-induced weather events that I talked about earlier, that Susan Collins was very concerned about. And that plan hasn't gone into action yet, but we are really working on it, and we are hoping that our members of Congress will be paying attention to that and other similar efforts, and that they will lead to basically a new industrial revolution, such that we, instead of relying on coal, oil, and natural gas, we will go into other forms of energy, for instance, like solar and wind, battery storage, and other currently unimaginable inventions that will be brought into play with such a price on carbon fuels.
I'm excited about this carbon fee and dividend too, because it makes fossil fuels more expensive, and that really makes an incentive for everybody to switch over to renewable energy. And it doesn't cost us any money, because every month we'd be getting a check, and that would pay for the increase in costs. Now, if you like this idea, one of the things we can do about it is to call our federal representatives and ask them to support it. Right now, you know, the fossil fuel industry is the richest industry the world has ever known, and they influence politics a lot. They campaign donations, and you know, I get that. They're in the business of making money, so they want to delay the transition to renewable energy. They want to be able to sell their product as long as they can. But you know, this is a democracy, and the people's voice is supposed to be what calls the shots, not corporate money. So I think it's really important that we start to make our voices heard, to take back control of what our climate policy is. I think, you know, what Americans want from our government is, well, we care more about our children than anything else, and so we want the government to protect the future climate. There's several ways that we can cause, you know, our government to be more responsive. One of them is just to call up all our representatives, find out or investigate the candidates before they're elected. Find out what they think about protecting our climate, promoting renewable energy. And then we can vote with that in mind. Another thing is that we can call all our representatives, ask them to support the carbon fee and dividend, ask them to support policies in Maine that promote renewable energy. And if you really want to make a big difference with the political system, you can volunteer for the candidate who we can see would really be a hero for our children's future.
Dick, I'd also like to sort of point out that some organizations, local organizations, are actually taking the ball in their court by themselves and not even waiting for government because it's in their interest and it's in the economy's interest. I noticed that Bar Harbor, for example, now has put solar panels on its municipal buildings to use for its own electricity. And there was so much excitement about that, they're building a community solar farm where residents can become a part of that process and get their solar energy for there and become part of it. And now there's a climate group formed for the whole Mount Desert Island, and they have committed to become energy independent by 2030.
Wow.
And this is basically on their own, doing it for their own interests, but I think it's encouraging for all of us that this is going on. For the rest of us, it also, we have organizations like Efficiency Maine that in fact have money and can help incentivize people to do the kind of work that we're talking about today. And many of their programs are designed in a way so that if you know it would save you money but you don't have the money up front, you can get a loan from many of the banks now give special deals on these kinds of loans, and Efficiency Maine has PACE loans by themselves. And they're designed so that if you take out a loan to pay for this energy efficiency investment, like weatherizing your home and doing the kinds of things we heard from early, it's designed so that the monthly payment on the loan is less than the savings you get from the work that you're having done. And so it actually, there's a net gain to you rather than a net loss. So the upfront costs should not be a particular barrier because the loans can be paid off simply by the savings that you're accruing. It's a very interesting set of programs, and Efficiency Maine has been very effective at it.
Thank you.
I have another thing I'd like to mention. We've talked about how the oceans are rising, and part of that is because the ice caps near the North Pole, Greenland, for example, and also at the South Pole, have been melting in a way that has not happened before. And we don't seem to have any way to stop this from happening. But another problem that we have, especially in California, I've heard about it, is, and it's other parts of the world as well, where they have been, during the wintertime, on the high mountains, accumulations of snow, maybe some of it turns into ice, and then in the springtime and early summer, it melts and the water drains toward the places where they are growing crops. Look at California, for example. The state of California has already started to put legal limits on the amount of water that you can use, in part because for your home or whatever, they want to reserve that water to be available for growing the crops. And the farmers there are having a lot of trouble. I remember hearing fairly recently about one who is now growing cactus. And there are people who will eat that kind of cactus on land because there's not enough water on his land to grow the normal kinds of vegetables and things that he formerly did. So if we're going to survive, we have to have food to eat.
We'd like to close by saying that the overarching message that we'd like to share with you today is to recognize that we do have wonderful opportunities to move to a sustainable energy future while lowering costs in both the short run and the long run. The secret, of course, is combining a more efficient use of energy, which reduces energy waste, with taking advantage of the plunging prices of local renewable energy. Many businesses, homes, municipalities, nonprofits have already begun this transition, benefiting both them and the economy as a whole. The beauty of this transition is that while it saves money and positions us for the future, it also reduces carbon pollution. Reduced carbon pollution in return reduces the threats posed by a modifying climate. Lowering these threats not only reduces the damages and enhances future national security, but it also allows us to live up to the obligations that we have to protect our grandchildren. As Ben Franklin once put it, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Those opportunities are within our grasps. It's up to us to seize them. We hope and we believe that this generation is up to that task. Thank you.
Thank you.